Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And when it comes to things that are legitimately scary, there are few fictional stories that can compete with real-world events. Naturally, it's easier to process a disturbing story about monsters, mass killers, and evil clowns, because on top of not being real, the scope of their story puts a cap on just how scary they can be. By contrast, real events, especially those that are well documented and researched, they tend to hit differently. The mere thought that these things really happen is not going to sit well with us. Even if it happened centuries ago, even if it were just a one-off event that can never happen again, they can still evoke a unique kind of fear. Now, I often find myself contemplating this around Halloween every year. Throughout the month of October, I often go out of my way to watch horror movies, both new and old. And while some do deliver more than others in terms of the fright factor, I also find myself looking up real-world scary stories. Be it stories about crime, people's experiences with the supernatural, or just disturbing facts in general. I will take a greater interest in it, if only to get me in the Halloween spirit. And in that spirit, I would like to share what I believe to be one of the scariest real events from world history. Now, I freely admit that I am no historian. I'm also aware that there are many well-documented horrors throughout human history. The 20th century alone has given us some especially terrifying moments, including multiple genocides, egregious crimes against humanity, and even natural disasters that evoked fear and unrest with millions. But as awful as these events were, the modern world has one major advantage. Thanks to technology, science, and more access to better information, humanity has a better understanding of the mechanisms behind these events. Sure, we can still be deeply disturbed by what soldiers do to civilians during times of war, or what governments do to their own people, but we can rationalize it to some extent. That also helps us process natural disasters. They too can be plenty scary, especially when we can't predict them. But even when a storm hits or a major earthquake strikes without warning, we can understand that this is just part of the natural world. All we can do is rebuild and regroup. But go back further in time. Go back to before the advent of modern tools and advanced science. Try to put yourself in the mindset of someone who has no such understanding. Now, imagine something so big, so unknown, and so terrifying occurring throughout the world. And even if that world doesn't extend beyond your home or village, you still feel it, you still experience it. That's bound to be a lot scarier for you and everyone around you. But that's largely what happened in the year 536 AD. Some historians have even gone on record as saying that this was the worst year in all of recorded history. And as I've looked into it and thought about it, I'm actually inclined to agree. While I don't consider myself a big history buff, I do have an interest in it, and I freely admit that I did not know about the horrors of year 536 until very recently. I only found out about it during the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic in the year 2020. Even though the events of that year are still relatively fresh, most people who lived through it agreed that it was bad. It was one of those rare historical events that was not restricted to a nation, a region, or a certain group of people. But when you compare the events of 2020 to the events of the year 536, there really is no comparison. What unfolded that year and what it incurred in the years that followed, I truly believe that it's entirely warranted to call it the scariest year in history. While there was no single event that made this year so awful, much of the horrors can be attributed to a prolonged volcanic winter. There is significant evidence from tree rings and ice cores that the world at the time had undergone some major volcanic activity. But it wasn't just one single eruption that impacted a certain region. It was actually multiple eruptions that took place simultaneously in different parts of the world, spewing immense amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. Call it a fluke of nature, call it an act of God, call it a three-pronged assault of bad luck in worse circumstances. But the end result was an impact that was truly global. You don't have to be a volcanologist or a meteorologist to know what this sort of thing does to the planet's climate. Throw a bunch of ash and dust into the atmosphere, and you're going to get weather patterns that aren't just severe. To many people, they feel downright apocalyptic. And based on what few records remain from the year 536, we do have a small idea of just how bad it got. Accounts from Rome and Central Europe describe prolonged periods where the sky was shrouded with clouds and haze. That meant longer winters with the grounds being covered in frost throughout the year. There also wasn't much in terms of rain or snow, which was not good at a time when most of the population relied on subsistence farming. Other accounts from the Middle East and China weren't much better. Tang Dynasty records describe severe cold coupled with serious famine. Other records from Syria say the sun didn't shine for more than half the year. There's even evidence of massive droughts in South America, which led to the collapse of numerous native societies. Now, this is all plenty bad. Terrible weather, crop failures, and severe famine is a potent recipe for misery and suffering. But it still got worse than that. While it didn't occur exactly in the year 536, the events of that year had so weakened multiple societies that it left them especially vulnerable to disease. When people are hungry, weak, and trying to stay warm through prolonged winters, plagues are going to have a much easier time spreading. And that's exactly what happened. Just a few years after 536, waves of bubonic plague swept through Europe, Egypt, and the Middle East. It eventually came to be known as the Plague of Justinian. By some estimates, 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire perished. While this plague isn't as well known as the Black Death or the Spanish flu, make no mistake, this was one of the worst plagues in human history. And a big part of what made it so bad were the conditions caused by what occurred in the year 536. Pretty much anyone alive during this time would have been scared, on top of being hungry and cold. But looking at it from hundreds of years in the future, I don't think anyone can appreciate how it must have seemed at the time. Just take a moment to imagine day-to-day life in the year 536. Unless you're a ruler or a religious leader, you're just an ordinary person trying to survive, either by farming or herding animals. And before this fateful year, there was at least some semblance of order to your world. The seasons came and went, the sun rose and set, harvests varied, but you could still rely on natural cycles to some extent. But then, one year, it all just descends into chaos. Suddenly, clouds from afar roll in, blocking the sun, denying you and your family its warmth. And in the months where it should be hot and humid, it's still cold. And in the months where you brace for cold, it's far colder than any season before it. You don't know why it's happening. You wake up every morning, look out your window, and agonize over this mysterious haze that hasn't faded. Your stomach is also probably growling. Your children are probably crying, begging for food that you cannot provide them. You turn to your local leaders, but they offer no answers. And in some cases, they might actually steal what little food you have, if not out of desperation, then most certainly to feed their armies, which probably matter more to them than you and your family. You then try turning to your religious leaders, but their answers offer little hope. Some may claim that this is just a test of faith. Others might claim that this is a punishment from the gods or a sign that the end times are near. The only recourse is to repent and trust in these leaders to appeal to the gods. But no matter how much you or your family pray, no reprieve comes. No miracles arrive to clear the skies or save the crops. You have no idea if this is just happening to you or if this is playing out all over the world. All you can do is endure. All you can do is fight to survive. And even if you do, even if you make it through this hardship and reap a better harvest, you start seeing your neighbors become ill with plague. It would almost seem like a punishment to those who survived the famine, now having to see this invisible ailment wipe out entire swaths of your community. In many respects, it's a lot scarier than any Lovecraftian monster that you can see or sense. It's also far scarier than any demons, devils, killers, or armies, because those are just tales you can ignore or threats that you can run from. But you can't do that with nature. And in the year 536, nature hit humanity during a precarious moment in time. We had yet to develop into a people that could grasp the intricacies of the world around us. There's just no way the people of the time could have prepared for such a terrible year. And even if they could, that wouldn't make it less scary. It would have only reminded them of how powerless they were in the grand scheme of things. And that's always a scary thought, and one that we all came to grips with during the COVID-19 pandemic. We all were at the mercy of forces that we could not see, hear, or touch. It was like a year-long storm, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The best we could do was wait it out. It led to a great deal of misery and suffering. But the fear that came with it, the idea that we really are helpless when certain natural forces converge around us, that was a rare kind of horror. Now, the year 2020 will always be the worst year for the generations of people who lived through it. But when you compare that to what happened to our ancestors in the year 536, it is worth keeping things in perspective, even if that perspective is legitimately scary. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and even in the face of fear, be brave.